Well, I think we're ready if you're ready. Okay.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Steve Etop. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Door County Environmental Council that proudly brings you the program this evening. We've got a terrific program for you with an outstanding speaker who I will introduce in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk to you a little about the Door County Environmental Council. The Environmental Council is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We've spent 50 years preserving and protecting the Door County environment. 50 years of fighting for nature, and sometimes in court, sometimes in the court of public opinion. I recently had a couple of experiences that surprised me. I met with two different, I would call them prominent Door County residents, and to talk about the Environmental Council. Neither one knew anything about the Door County Environmental Council. So I emailed them a draft of our 50-year anniversary that we've handed out to you folks tonight. And there will be an exam later, so I hope you're reading it. Later, I talked to both of them. They were both absolutely blown away, flabbergasted that they did not know anything about the Door County Environmental Council. Well, that surprised me, and it was a revelation, I guess, that I could say that the Door County Environmental Council has been too humble about what we've accomplished. But the other side of that is that we just haven't done a good enough job in promoting what we're doing in Door County, and it's important. Little things like the fact that the Door County Environmental Council started the Door County Land Trust. A lot of people don't know that, that we were the impetus behind that, and they've done a tremendous job, and we're very proud of them. So I stop and I think for a second. I want to ask you, why do people come to Door County? Why do they want to live here? What brings them up to this peninsula? Is it the wonderful lodging and accommodations that we have in housing? The fine dining, the restaurants, maybe it's the beer gardens and the breweries and the wineries. Maybe it's the music. We've got tremendous music here, tremendous musicians and a wide variety. We've got the arts, we've got artisans, and we've got recreation like you can't believe. We've got hiking, biking, swimming, boating, sailing, golfing, fishing, you name it, we've got it. So is that the reason why people come here, is all of these man-made amenities? And I think, well, yeah, that people like that they like to come here and do all these things. There's no argument about that. But my argument is, if you magically took all of these things that I'm talking about, all these man-made things, and you, with all of the people that associated with them, and plunked it down in the middle of Iowa, or the middle of Nebraska, or the middle of Illinois, or the middle of Indiana, would they have the same draw? Would they have the same amount of people coming, the same number of people wanting to live there? I say they would not. So people come here for something other than those amenities. Those amenities are wonderful, don't misunderstand me, but they are the frosting on the cake as far as I'm concerned. The cake is the natural beauty of Door County, the environment that we live in. Just look out there. I mean, does it get any prettier than that? The tourism folks are going to attract more visitors here. I just read in the paper tonight, maybe you saw that the census in Door County, the population, they had predicted that was going to go down a little bit. It went up by 8% since the last census was taken. That's quite a leap. And I don't think that trend is going to go away. So we're going to have more people coming here. We're going to have more tourists. And we're going to have more people that are going to live here. Well, okay, that is going to happen, whether we like it or not. The real problem in Door County is that we have no master development plan. You know, they say plan with the end in mind, but we have no plan at all. And Door County is interesting, and perhaps you know this, but we have 14 towns in Door County. 9 of the towns are covered under have agreed to the comprehensive Door County zoning. 2 of the towns have their own zoning. 3 of the towns have no zoning at all. You can do anything there. One of the towns that has no zoning does have some zoning rules, in all fairness, but incredible to me, no zoning. We also have 3 or 4 villages that also have their own zoning that don't subscribe to the comprehensive zoning of Door County. So count out how many different types of zoning we have, or no zoning at all. Door County is often compared with Cape Cod. Are there people here that have been to Cape Cod? How many people have been to Cape Cod? Oh, we got a lot of people that have been to Cape Cod. Terrific. Now you know what I'm talking about. I visited Cape Cod and I was amazed by how well they have done in preserving the natural environment there. You don't see too many large condo projects and so on going on. They have more than Cape Cod has over twice the number of tourists annually compared to Door County, well over twice. But they've done a better job of protecting the environment. How in the world did they do that? What can we learn from their experience? I think we can learn a lot. They found a way to protect the environment while accommodating economic prosperity, including high quality tourism. How did they do that? Well, they've got 15 towns in Cape Cod. Actually, it's Barnstable County, as you know, is all of Cape Cod. And they have 15 towns. All 15 of the towns have a representative on what's called the Cape Cod Commission. The Cape Cod Commission, the 15 members and 4 outside members, for a total of 19 people on the Cape Cod Commission. They go out and they hire professionals, they hire engineers, landscape architects, environmentalists, folks that know a lot about urban planners, folks that know a lot about planning for the future. The various towns then can send any would-be project voluntarily to the Cape Cod Commission for their analytic review. The Cape Cod Commission also will automatically handle any project that impacts more than 1 town. In other words, if it impacts 2 towns, it comes to the Cape Cod Commission before it goes back to one of the 14 towns. Now, if the Cape Cod Commission approves a project, it still goes back to the town, who can veto it and say, no, we don't want that, even though you approved it. So the towns retain their authority over what happens in the towns, but they get professional help on the front end in analyzing these projects, which is terrific in my mind. I think we could learn a lot from Cape Cod. We can't automatically replicate what they've done there, but I think we can look. They have Massachusetts is far different than the way their state is run than Wisconsin is. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from the concepts that they've employed in Barnstable County and Cape Cod, that they've done a great job with more tourists and less land area than Door County has. And it's interesting because, as you know, it's a peninsula that juts out about 70 miles into the Atlantic Ocean, and Door County, the county itself, juts out, maybe 80 miles. So they both have a lot of shoreline, and when you're coming here, you're not going somewhere else. This is the destination. Okay, just a concept for you to think about, and I'd like to think that in the year to come that we can get our local government, we can get our media, we can get groups like the Door County Environmental Council to investigate what have they done in Cape Cod, and is any of it applicable here? That's just a question. Okay. I can look out the window there and I can see the blue waters of the bay, and think about how beautiful this is. But is it going to stay that beautiful? What if that blue water out there had sort of rafts of floating algae, blue-green, toxic blue-green algae on it. What would happen then? What would happen then to our quality of life? What would happen to our economy? That water out there is probably the primary thing we need to protect in Door County. I don't know an awful lot about the Bay of Green Bay and the waters. I'm not a scientist, but luckily we have an expert with us tonight who's going to tell us more about it. Let me introduce Professor Val Klump. Val Klump joined the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 1980, where he currently serves as professor and dean of the School of Freshwater Sciences. His research on how nutrients and carbon are cycled in lakes has taken him from the deepest soundings in Lake Superior and Lake Michigan aboard a research submersible to the largest and oldest lakes in the world, Lake Baikal in eastern Siberia. His recent research has highlighted the presence and dynamics of dead zones in the Bay of Green Bay, which of course is part of Lake Michigan, including the impact of climate change on the extent and duration of these dead zones. Dr. Klump holds a BS in zoology from Duke University, a degree in law from Georgetown University, isn't that interesting, and a PhD in marine science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Let's give a warm Door County welcome to Dr. Klump.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thanks everybody for coming out this evening and spending time in here when it's such beautiful weather. I'm going to start off with a little quiz. What I've done here is I've taken the liberty, as you know, we live on an aquatic planet. I mean, 70% of the world's surface is covered with water. Most of it's ocean water too. I'm taking the liberty of condensing that all into this liter of water. And so my question to you is, if I were going to open this up and pour into this cup all of the water which is actually available surface freshwater, how much would I pour into this cup? Anybody want to guess? Well, actually, can't really pour it. You have to use a dropper. So it turns out there are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 12 drops in this liter that represent the the available fresh water, and there go that's the Great Lakes right there. A little careless of me, but just goes to show you how lucky we are, right? I mean, we live on the shores, literally a stone's throw away here from the greatest, without question, the greatest resource, freshwater resource on the face of the earth. I'll set the ocean aside. But despite their size, these are surprisingly fragile ecosystems. And one of the reasons is because it's not just the lakes. We live around these lakes. 40 million people draw their drinking water out of the Great Lakes. If you were to take the Great Lakes and spread it out across the entire United States, it would cover the entire 48 states to a depth of 9.5 feet. It would actually cover both North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. It would completely cover both North and South America. It's an amazing amount of water. But as I said, despite the fact that it's such a huge system, it is still surprisingly fragile and susceptible to impacts. And there's been a study done in which they've looked at 34 different stresses on the ecosystem. I mean, you can think of everything from nutrients to contaminants to climate change to transportation to shoreline erosion, etc. And the group, admit Peter here, the group that did this study actually then combined those into an aggregate, a cumulative stress. And in this chart, red is a higher area stress and blue is the lowest. A couple of things you can point out. One, the stress is greatest near the near shore, right? And that's where we live, right? So that makes sense. And as you go downstream in the Great Lakes, you see higher stressed area. And that also makes sense because everything as we know, flows downhill. Some interesting points to show here. What you might guess what this is. This is the shipping lane in Lake Superior shows up. You can see the Lake Superior is the least impacted, obviously, the most pristine lake in the Great Lakes. If you go back to 1969, some of you may recognize this photograph. This is a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, which caught on fire. Now, it wasn't the only time the Cuyahoga caught on fire, and it wasn't the only river in the Great Lakes that caught on fire, but this particular image was on the cover of Time magazine and really caught the attention of people. And one of the key things that triggered, I think, the environmental movement. And as a result, at the time, Lake Erie was declared dead. It was thought that it would never recover. And it really triggered the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972 and a whole series of environmental legislation during the Nixon administration. And then as a result of this, though, we invested significantly in primarily point source controls of nutrients, primarily in municipal wastewater treatment plants. And the target was about a 60% reduction in phosphorus loading to the system, to Lake Erie. And by the mid-1980s, we actually reached that target. And voila, the Lake Erie improved dramatically. And what I call the Seuss Effect. If you're old enough to know that probably you read this to your kids or grandchildren, Dr. Seuss's book, the Lorax, and there's a line in there. So, well, they walk on, talking about fish, they walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water that isn't so schmeary. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. Well, the people in Lake Erie said, hey, so wait a second, Dr. Seuss, you know, things have actually improved. And they wrote him and he responded. And as a result, he said, oh, I'm going to take that line out of the book. So if you go in the library today downstairs and you get a copy of the Lorax, unless it's a very old copy, you'll no longer see that line. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. But of course, things change. And this is Lake Erie today. And this is a massive algal bloom. This was actually taken in September 2017, but this has been a recurring event now for probably a decade or so. Anytime you can see an algal bloom from outer space, you probably have a problem. And so they have a significant one in the western basin of Lake Erie, and you can see these blooms actually propagate into the central basin as well. This is an aerial photograph, and that little dot right there is a 1,000-footer, and ones that tie up down in Sturgeon Bay. And you can see the wake as it has gone through that bloom. The organism which causes is actually a cyanobacteria, often referred to as blue-green algae. It's microcystin, and it produces an algal toxin, one of the most toxic substances known as a liver toxin. And in 2014, it was detected in the Toledo water intake, which serves about 500,000 people. They had to shut off the water. They were told you can't drink it, don't wash your hands in it, you can't boil it, don't give it to your pets. Hospitals couldn't use the water to sterilize instruments. They had to bring in water for animals in the zoo. It was indeed a Cuyahoga moment. And people woke up to the fact that we have, a massive problem. And so the system has changed. And so today we have in a number of places around the world, we'll take these harmful algal blooms, and Green Bay is no exception. And I'll talk more about Green Bay a little bit later. But first I'll talk about some sort of non-conventional pollution threats. And just two quick categories. One is spills and the other is emerging contaminant spills. You're probably familiar with this article series written by Ann's son, Dan Egan, who, the fantastic journalist, did the series on dangerous straits, talking about a pipeline called Line 5, which is, there are two pipelines that actually cross from the Upper Peninsula, Lower Peninsula, Straits of Mackinac. These are over 60 years old now. The company that operates those wanted to increase the flow. The only way you can increase flow in a pipe of a known, a set diameter is actually increase the pressure. And people got concerned that these pipelines were told if they were to ever break, we ever have a rupture. And this is where you can see where they cross actually. Of course, pipelines are used to transport petroleum and oil all over the country, and they're probably one of the safest ways to do that, but they are not infallible. And we know that We know that for a fact. Some colleagues of mine did a study like to simulate what would be the impact of an oil spill if one of these lines were to break. And this is the results of that simulation. You can see the clock running there. It says 3.5 days. So the Straits of Mackinac are one of the most dynamic areas in the entire Great Lakes because the water sloshes back and forth between Huron and Michigan, depending on which way the wind blows. And so oil disperses very fast. If this were to occur, it would be almost impossible to clean up. One, because it disperses so quickly, and two, you know, oil spills are, pretty common in the Gulf of Mexico, but in the Great Lakes, it's different. For one thing, you can't use the same dispersants that they use in the ocean because we drink this water. So many of the chemicals they use, we couldn't use. Plus, it's a much colder system. So evaporation, volatilization, bacterial degradation rates are going to be very slow. So my feeling is if that ever happened, we would not recover from it, period, at least in a reasonable series of lifetimes. So you can see this is 20 days, 18 days after that kind of a spill. And it has happened back in, let's see, 2010, there was a pipeline actually operated by the same company, which broke. It was on the coast of Kalamazoo River, spilled about 1 million gallons of tar sand oil in the Kalamazoo River. Now the Kalamazoo River runs into Lake Michigan. I have a colleague and a friend who is the operator of the Linwood filtration plant, which is the main water supply, drinking water supply in Milwaukee. And Lon called me, I think that this broke on a Friday. He called me Sunday night and he said, oh, do I need to worry about this oil getting into Lake Michigan, into our water intake? And I said, no, EPA claims that they've, it's really been held within the river system. It doesn't look like it's going to get into Lake Michigan. And in fact, it didn't, but obviously it's a concern. It took over 6 years to clean up and $1 billion. So it happens. And so that, it's something we got to think about and be careful. And how we deal with these lakes, because I say that this is not something we would ever recover from. There's also a whole set of contaminants, pollution known as emerging contaminants, things like pharmaceuticals, nanomaterials, pesticides, personal care products, PFAS. You've heard a lot about PFAS, the forever chemical, microplastics, et cetera. One of our scientists, and I just mentioned microplastics there. The word, I put 2050 there to remind me, there's a projection that by the year 2050, that the biomass of plastics in the ocean will exceed the biomass of fish. The biomass of plastics will exceed the biomass of fish, even if it's close. It's just kind of a mind-boggling thought. Of course, pharmaceuticals is a major issue. I mean, the same property that makes them effective as medicines, although they persist in our bodies, makes them that they also will actually translate through conventional sewage treatment plants largely unchanged. And although it's a testament to our analytical capabilities, we can see these in the lake. We basically can see the entire medicine chest out there. Now, some of them survive longer, some of them do decay away, but many of them remain unaltered. Metformin, here is a list of a variety of things, including, some antibacterials, some things like sulfonamide, naproxen. Everybody, I take that, every time I shovel the driveway. Metformin is a type 2 diabetes drug. It's one of the most heavily prescribed drugs in the U.S. It's estimated, and this is work by Rebecca Clapper and her students, that metformin, the discharge from the South Shore Sewage Treatment Plant, which is one of 2 sewage treatment plants in Milwaukee, is 6,400 kilograms per year. That's about 12,000 pounds of metformin discharged into Lake Michigan. Her graduate student, Ben Blair, was defending his thesis a while back, giving his dissertation defense. And he was showing his data. And I finally raised my hand. I said, Ben, what is the lowest concentration you measured? Because Lake Michigan is a big system. And I figured once you get far enough offshore, you basically beyond detection. He said, well, actually, the lowest we ever measured was 10, whatever the units were. They never measured zero. They never measured zero, which means two things. One, it's coming in, pretty consistently. And two, it's not going away. It's persisting. So, the $64,000 question, of course, is, what is the impact of these chemicals in the system? Rebecca and her students have done some studies on yellow perch, and it turns out metformin at concentrations that we can see in the environment have a feminizing effect on yellow perch, i.e. male yellow perch will develop egg-like material in their gonads. Now, some of these have no effect whatsoever. I mean, as I said, they are at vanishingly small concentrations. But as it turns out, sometimes one will not have an effect, another will not have an effect, but you put them together, you do see synergistic effects. We're just now beginning to scratch the surface of what this means for our system. The Great Lakes are closed systems, and I'll get back to that later, which means that things don't wash out very fast. I have another colleague who measured iodine 131, which is a radioactive pharmaceutical, has a very short half-life, 8 days, which means every 8 days, half of it disappears, decays. And you can consistently see this pharmaceutical in the nearshore waters of Lake Michigan, which means it's constantly coming in. Where's it coming from? It's coming from the sewage treatment systems. Because as you take the drugs and you excrete it, it goes into sewage treatment systems. Turn off the sound here. If you're gonna ask me what's the biggest impact that's happened in the Great Lakes in the last 20 years, it's this: non-native species. There have been about 180 different non-native species, invasive species that come into the Great Lakes. Probably the most notorious is the sea lamprey, which you probably all remember, which we have been controlling since the 1960s. But there have been others as well, the alewife, which is now a huge part of the ecosystem, and of course, dry-sided mussels. This video was taken shortly after zebra mussels invaded Lake Michigan. This is the rocky nearshore of Lake Michigan. Two things to look at in this video. One is you can see these rocks are totally covered with zebra mussels. There was nothing like that in the Great Lakes. There's no encrusting bivalve. This was a niche that was completely empty in the Great Lakes until dry-sided mussels moved in. The other thing you notice, the water is crystal clear. It looks like the Bahamas. And that's the other impact that these dry-sided mussels have had. The lakes are susceptible because the food chains and the food webs are relatively simple. I mean, these are, evolutionarily speaking, fairly young systems, only a few thousand years old. So it's not like a marine system, which is very complex, lots of niches. We have a lot of niches in which these invasive species can move into. Asian carp is another one, which I'm sure you've heard about. And we're also an international system. We're 2 ports a call away from the rest of the world, essentially. And so we are open to, and that's the way most of these non-native species have gotten into the system, is many of them through ballast water. Just to give you an idea of the impact that dry-sided mussels have had in Lake Michigan, the zebra mussels invaded in the early 1990s. About 10 years later, a sister dry-sided, which at arm's length looks just like a zebra mussel, it's known as a quagga mussel, it's another dry-sided, entered Lake Michigan as well. And the difference between the two is quagga mussels can live on, whereas zebra mussels have to live on a hard substrate, something that can attach to a boat hull or a bulkhead or a rock. In the near shore, quagga mussels can live on soft substrates, muddy bottoms, and they can also live in deeper and colder water. And so quagga mussels actually, in a very short period of time, when they entered in the early 2000s in the northern parts, within only a handful of years, essentially colonized the entire lake. You're hard pressed now to find a zebra mussel in Lake Michigan because quagga mussels have totally outcompeted them. One of the impacts has been that one of the major benthic organisms, an organism that lives in the sediments of the lake, a little amphipod, a little shrimp-like fellow called Diparia, completely disappeared. Now that was one of the major food sources for bloater chub, the smoked fish, which is very difficult to find now. I mean, that population is essentially crashed, and water clarity increased in that because they filter so effectively, these mussels will filter about 1 liter per day, each one. This is a trawl that was done off of Lake Michigan, Fox Point, which is just up north of Milwaukee. This was a bag trawl that was done off our research vessel. We got one fish. This is designed to collect fish. And it turns out that one fish is a round goby, which is also an invasive. And this is actually a video of one of those trawls. You could essentially walk across a carpet of quagga mussels now from Milwaukee to Muskegon. They have basically taken over the system, and they have completely re-engineered the ecosystem. So Lake Michigan doesn't look anything like it used to, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There's an estimate there are 950 trillion of these quagga mussels in the lake. The water clarity has increased dramatically in the offshore. Lake Superior, which is one of the most pristine lakes in the world, is now the third clearest lake in the Great Lakes. Both Lake Huron and Lake Michigan have a higher water clarity than Lake Superior, and it's because of the filtering capacity of these mussels. And you can see a significant decline in primary production, 70%. But of course, it's not the only impact. And of course, if any ecologist can tell you what the impact of an invasive species is going to be, you can tell them forget it, because you just never know what the ripple effects are going to be. And here's just one example. Before dry sentence moved in, of course, Lake Michigan, in normal conditions, a fairly turbid system. Water clarity wasn't that high. But after mussels moved in, they did three things that stimulated the growth of Cladophora, horsehair algae, which was the poster child actually for phosphorus removal back in the 1960s. They increased water clarity in the near shore, so now light can get to the bottom in a much vaster area than it used to be. They also provide a substrate for these algae to attach to, and they also bring the nutrients down to the bottom. So they apply all three things that Cladophora needs, and as a result now, in the near shore is one vast meadow of Cladophora, and this is what the near shore of Lake Michigan looks like today. You can't see the mussels, but they're there. They're underneath the Cladophora. One of the impacts of that is when this algae senesces, dies, breaks off Y of action, it washes up on the beach. This is north of Milwaukee, and it begins to decompose. Turns out it is the perfect environment for the organism which causes botulism. And so avian botulism has had a resurgence in the Great Lakes, and even up here in Door County, and I've seen it up along the shore off of Newport Beach, say Park. So this is not really, when this first started happening, this algae, of course, when it washes up on the beach, it smells horrible when it starts to decompose. Everybody would blame the sewage treatment plant. Not the sewage treatment plant. It's happening Sleeping Bear. It's happening over here. It's happening in all parts of the lake. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good example. I mean, and that's one of the most, pristine areas in the Great Lakes. So interestingly enough, we have, the lakes are going in both directions. We have unprecedented these nearshore harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, and also we're seeing now in Green Bay, and unprecedented offshore water clarity. So the lakes are going in both directions. What about climate change? Of course, hydrologic systems, freshwater systems in particular, and lakes especially, are probably some of the most highly susceptible systems on the planet to changes in climate, because they are controlled almost completely. Their hydrology is completely controlled by climate. Here's a plot of global temperature, and I've been giving lectures on this for, well, sorry, I can tell you probably 20 years or so. Every year I've said the same thing, that the 5 hottest years have all occurred in the last 15 years. Well, now the 7 hottest years have been the 7 last years. Every year has been within a hot year. 2020 probably looks, I haven't seen the recent data, but it's within a smidgen of tying 2016 as the hottest year on record. And this isn't going to slow down. It doesn't look like. You've probably seen the last ICCP report. For our region here, the predictions are for both warmer and wetter conditions. warmer by the end of the century to 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. If it's 9 degrees, that's really a big change. I mean, that is really a big change. A 10 to 20% increase in precipitation. It certainly seems that way recently. Projection here, this is for Madison, actually, nearly 2 months over 90 degrees. And I think over a week of temperatures over 100. Now, I've lived in Milwaukee since 1980. I don't remember ever hitting 100 degrees there, and rarely hitting 90, but we've seen 90 degrees now in Milwaukee this past summer, even, several times. Here's just a comparison of surface water temperatures. These are two animations of actual data, 1992 and 2012. Now, I use this example because 2012 used to be a really warm year, but it's not in the top 7 anymore. And you can see as you can see, purple is warm. So you can see that in 2012, how much warmer both Lake Michigan and Lake Superior are. We've seen surface water temperatures in the middle of Lake Michigan, 80 degrees. Now that's pretty unheard of. And we're now seeing an irregular occurrence. Summer water temperatures in Lake Superior have increased 6 degrees since 1980. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, it's gotten warmer, but also water temperatures are rising twice as fast as air temperatures in Lake Superior. And the reason for that is because ice cover is decreasing. When the lake is covered with ice, it basically reflects the sunlight and doesn't gain any heat. Once ice moves off the lake, then it can absorb the heat from the sun and starts to warm up. As the ice period gets shorter and shorter and the open water period gets longer and longer, it can accept more and more heat from the sun. And that's why lake temperatures are increasing faster than air temperatures. Now, of course, that reaches a limit, right? Once you don't have any more ice, then you can't heat the lake any more than you would normally. And it looks as if we're sort of headed in that direction. It's also getting much wetter. Warm air can hold more water, and as a result, you're getting more precipitation. This is I think 4 of the top 8 wettest years in record. This is for the city of Green Bay, have occurred since in the last decade. 2019 was the wettest. 18 was the wettest year on record. 2019 was even more wet. In fact, it was wet by quite a bit, almost. So these are in inches here. So almost 9 inches more than 2018. And I'm sure you remember this photograph here. Was a rainstorm and a squall that was actually, I took this photograph off our research festival in Green Bay here last Wednesday, a week ago, and that storm moved through. That was kind of exciting. It rained and it blew like crazy. I mean, you don't see much waves because the wind was just knocking the waves down. It was we didn't do much for about an hour and a half waiting for that to pass through. One of the predictions is that we'll get more rain, but we'll get it in more frequent intense rain events. So a 50 to 100% increase in intense rain events. And of course, our infrastructure is not designed with that climate in mind. Our sewer systems, stormwater systems in a city like Milwaukee, some of them are 100 years old. The 100-year storm is not coming just every 100 years now. It's coming more like every 5 years. So it's going to be a major effort to try and deal with the new normal in climate change. I mentioned that lakes are highly susceptible to climate, that basically our climate controls lake levels in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, which are one lake hydrologically. In 2013, we hit an all-time low in Lake Michigan. People were crying because they couldn't get their boat in. The docks were, they had grass growing where they used to have a beach. And in a very short period of time, we hit all-time record highs. It didn't quite reach the all-time high in 1986, but it came very close. Today, it has dropped back a little bit. Long-term projections, 2 things control lake levels: the amount of precipitation we get and the amount of evaporation that occurs. Diversions in and out, there is no plug you can pull that lets water out, and there's no plug you can put in that keeps water in. Mother Nature controls this. More precipitation has lakes come up, warmer temperatures at higher evaporation, lake levels go down. And right now we've had a wetter conditions, and so lake levels have gone up. Long-term projections, the climatologists are saying the variability about the mean is going to get higher. Yeah, in other words, we're going to get higher highs and lower lows. So we're going to have to deal with both, the worst of both worlds, if you will, going forward. And so, you know, Steve talked about planning. If you're planning for the future climate, and you have to be, those are some of the things you got to think about. Okay, now Green Bay, which is I'm sure all very close, near, dear to your hearts. And I've been studying Green Bay for, you know, since the 1980s, so a long time. It's one of my favorite places on earth, the story can tell you. And several years ago, we did some studies looking at the oxygen dynamics in the bay, and it turns out, you know, the story hit the Wall Street Journal, you know, scientists, dead zones showing up in Green Bay. Well, dead zones are not a new phenomenon. Anyway, there are probably 500 different dead zones around the world. Almost all of them are in the ocean, although, the one in Lake Erie, Central Basin of Lake Erie, is pretty famous as well, but Green Bay had never been identified as having a dead zone. A dead zone is an area of water which the oxygen concentration is too low to support typical life. So fish can't live in it. Most benthic invertebrates can't live in it. Generally defined as anything below 2 milligrams per liter. So normal saturated concentration in Green Bay would be about 10. So anything below 2, so that'd be 20%. Saturation is considered what we call hypoxic, or in the vernacular, a dead zone. And this is what it looks like. It varies from year to year as the water moves around. The dynamics that we're looking at now, and we've done a lot of work on this. So why does it occur? Well, there are a number, in Green Bay, there are a number of circumstances that lead to the formation of these dead zones. One, of course, is the Fox River, which is a major source of nutrients to the entire Lake Michigan basin. About a third of the total phosphorus load to Lake Michigan comes out of the Fox River. So it's a major nutrient source. It's also a closed basin, although the water residence time is relatively short. It's only about 12 months, but it's long enough that it controls much of what goes on in the system. It's not a new problem. I mean, Green Bay has been hypereutrophic for decades. And water quality has improved dramatically as a result of Clean Water Act, but we still have a ways to go. So I say it's a reflection, the bay is simply a reflection of what we do on the land. So what drives this, these plumes, the sediments and everything come out of is what actually drives hypoxia in this system. We have data that indicates that, and this is from New Water, they have a continuous oxygen sensor in the bottom water near the entrance lake. And they've been collecting that data since the late 1980s. John Kennedy, a good friend of mine, was the one who started this program. And they've been able to keep it going with a few exceptions when they didn't do it. And it looks to us as if maybe hypoxia is increasing in more recent years, in both in duration, in a number of days, and also in the extent that's occurring. It occurs for several reasons. One, over-fertilization, excessive loading of nutrients, almost all of that's coming off the land. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Phosphorus loading to the system, despite the Clean Water Act, you name it, point source controls has not really changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And you can see in this graph that the point sources are all in these little bars at the bottom. The large fraction, or at least 50% of the total, is coming from agricultural sources, which is a problem we face today. The Clean Water Act was exceptionally good at controlling what's known as point sources, those discrete pipes, fissures that put pollutants into the lake. It did not do much of a job with non-point source. That is the stuff that runs off farm fields, city streets, et cetera. And it was easy to point your finger at the dozen or so paper mills or municipal treatment plants on the river and say, you guys have got to clean this up, and here's the standard. And we did that, and it was very successful. It's a different thing to deal with non-point sources. So now you're talking anybody who owns a piece of land. My neighbor a couple doors down, when he fertilizes his grass, and we live in these little postage stamps, homes in Whitefish Bay. Tom can tell you, he lives there too. He spreads the fertilizer right across the sidewalk. I said, Joe, I don't care how much fertilizer you put on a sidewalk, it'll never grow grass. But of course, the first time it rains, it washes off into the street, goes to the storm sewer, goes to the river, which goes to the lake. So it's everybody's responsibility, non-point source. And that's part of the problem. It's almost a sociological thing. They're now dealing with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people rather than a dozen, point source dischargers. These are some photographs that I took. This is now several years ago, but this is right off of Sturgeon Bay in the open waters of the bay where we saw massive algal blooms. You don't always see this every year, but it has become a more frequent occurrence. The other condition about the Green Bay is it's a very efficient trap. So material that gets into the bay does not really get out of the bay. 70%, we estimated, the phosphorus coming in from the Fox River is actually retained within the bay itself. This means that there's a lot of algal debris, et cetera, that accumulates in the sediments. And when that stuff starts to decompose, it consumes oxygen. And it's one of the major drivers behind these hypoxic dead zone events. The other thing is what I call sequestration. So when lakes warm up in the summertime, surface water warms when bottom water doesn't, and you get this warm layer, which is lighter and less dense over a cooler, dense layer. And that's known as thermal stratification. And essentially what happens then is that puts a cap on the lake. So the water, the oxygen in the bottom water, which is present when it first stratifies, has got to last the rest of the season until the lake remixes in the fall when the surface water cools down, because it's no longer in contact with the atmosphere. The longer that period goes, the lower the oxygen will drop in the system. And that's what's happening. So this is a summertime phenomenon in Green Bay. We were just out there last week and you could see the oxygen concentration was down close to zero at a couple of the stations that we measured. Another thing about Green Bay is let's have this estuarine circulation, sort of this countercurrent circulation. You get warm surface water coming out of the Fox River and out of the lower bay, and it moves north and it's warmer and it's lighter. And then along the bottom, you get this cool Lake Michigan water that comes in and you get this sort of countercurrent exchange. This water is moving at about 1 kilometer or 2 per day. And as it comes out of Lake Michigan, it's cold. And as it moves across these bottom sediments, the oxygen is slowly drawn down. So the point when it gets to the southern end of the bay, it's already pre-depleted. And when it hits some of these very organic rich sediments, it drops the oxygen almost to zero. And you get these hypoxic blobs, and has in the past actually caused significant, fish kills when, especially these gobies, which don't vertically migrate, they just go horizontally and it chases them right up onto the beach. This was a number of years ago. We haven't seen one recently. But if stratification is prolonged, climate change projections are that the growing season or the summertime period might increase by as long as 6 weeks. If we had a longer stratified period, this is just an example where you go from the condition in the center there to the one on the right, and the red indicates where oxygen would actually go to zero. Now, Green Bay is interesting because it's shallow. You get a big storm event like we had last week, and it can mix the bay completely, right top to bottom, because it's only about many places, 10 meters deep or so, and the wind can basically mix down to 10 meters. So occasionally it'll get re-aerated. But what happens is this hypoxic Lake Michigan cold water just moves in again and it'll bring it back down to zero very, very quickly. So the dynamics of the system are complex. So I say, because we have excess loading, if you get a lot of chlorophyll and algal production, if a bloom today, you'll have a dead zone tomorrow, because it is really fueled by the production caused by nutrient inputs to the system. These are some photographs taken by a friend of mine, Kevin Furman, some of you might know, a professor at UW-GB last October. These are cyanobacteria. You can tell because of the color. And not your normal green algae. This almost has a chemical, sort of a bluish hue to it. That was High Cliff Park, which is in Lake Winnebago, right? And then the Fox River, and this was at Bayshore Park, which it's just just south of Dykesville a little bit. So that's actually in the open water, what I would call the open waters of the bay. I have a colleague at UW, Todd Miller, who's an expert in harmful algal blooms and measuring these algal toxins, of which there are 300 different varieties just of microsystems. So it's analytically really difficult. So what's it going to take to restore Green Bay? I've been working with a group of people at UW Green Bay and Madison and in Ann Arbor, Michigan, looking at developing a whole series of ecosystem models. Basically, what you want to do with any ecosystem, be able to predict the future. The only way you can do that is if you have a model of the system. And the only way you can give a model of the system is if you understand the various dynamics that go into structuring that system, and you have the data to see where those models actually work. And so we've been working on this project now for several years. And it's not simple because there are a lot of moving parts. We have the hydrodynamics of the bay, which are very complicated. There's this contracurrent circulation. We have the biogeochemical models, which is my sort of area of expertise. We have the watershed loading, because that's really what's driving this system, is what's coming off the landscape. And that's Kevin and Paul Baumgart at UW Green Bay, and then the climate change models. Our climate change models are getting much better now because they have these downscaling techniques that can actually produce projections and scenarios out to the end of the century at relatively small spatial scales that are realistic to actually inform these kinds of models. So we're getting to the point where we can incorporate models into at the relative spatial scale that makes sense. A lot of confounding factors, changing land use and economic drivers, of course, and the changing face of agriculture. I don't have to tell you that, I mean, I've been driving back and forth to Green Bay for years. I don't see cows anymore, right? Because most of them are inside. There are more dairy cows now in Brown County than probably anywhere else on the face of the planet. Well, maybe not China, but certainly in the United States, it has the highest density of dairy cows. And as a result, it's a major challenge. How much, can the land actually support? One dairy cow produces as much waste as 18 people. And of course, the way we deal with that now is we spread the manure on the land, which is good because it is a fertilizer. But in fact, you don't have enough land to carry that manure. It becomes a problem. I mean, agriculture is important, right? I mean, I can't think of a more important industry. What other industry takes, energy from the sun and produces something we all need, food, right? So we have to solve this problem, and we can solve it. Ecosystem models can be really complex, and this hairball diagram is go, oh my gosh. And so one of the ways you simplify is you break it down. Okay, what's the limiting factor in this system? And phosphorus appears to be the nutrient which really drives algal production in this system. You could scale it back to the point where other things might come into place, but today phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. And so mainly the thing that we're interested in is the amount of bioavailable phosphorus, how that translates to algae, and how that algae, gets to the bottom, begins to decompose and consume oxygen. To do that, we developed a very highly resolved spatial model of the bay, all these grids. And you can see here's just one simulation, which is driven by the inflow of the Fox River. And this is predicting chlorophyll concentrations. In other words, the algal pigment that these algae produce. And you can see as it goes, over time. And we're getting realistic projections. Well, one of the good things that comes out of these models, it appears as if the bay responds pretty quickly and fairly dramatically. Now the reductions are pretty significant. So if you look at the baseline, this is sort of the current condition, right? So you see chlorophyll A, which is an algal pigment, it's high in the summertime. You can see dissolved oxygen gets low in the summertime. On the other hand, if we run a simulation where you reduce the load from the Fox River by 50%, you can see the bay responds pretty dramatically. The chlorophyll concentration drops by over half, and the oxygen concentration goes up to almost the baseline condition. So that's good news. It appears as if we can take this, we can actually make a significant increase. Now, a 50% reduction in phosphorus loading to Green Bay ain't gonna be easy. Lake Erie has the same problem and about the same order of magnitude, 40 to 60% reduction on the Maumee River. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done. The other thing too is these nutrient loading are very event driven. So it's the big rainstorms that actually drive nutrients into the system. You can see about, almost 90% of the TSS, that's the suspended sediment load, and over 70% of the total phosphorus load comes in those 14 days when it rains in the system. So if we can make the landscape resilient to these big rain events, which we know are increasing in intensity, right, and in frequency, that's one of the keys. We also know that not all parts of the landscape are equal in terms of the phosphorus load. There are some hot spots. And so as we attack this problem, we can attack those subwatersheds and catchments which have high phosphorus delivering. The purple one there is Plum Creek in the lower Fox River watershed. And this is data from Paul Baumgart and Kevin Furmanich at UW-GB. There are some encouraging signs. I mean, I think the agricultural community now is tuning into the fact that that this is a problem, and are looking at ways to reduce phosphorus. And there are a number of management options, things like, now in addition to point source controls, ratcheting down sewage treatment plants, et cetera, but also looking at covered crops, reduce tillage, managing manure better, improving soil health, using filter strips, buffer strips, et cetera, a whole variety of techniques. And here's some data. This is from the Outagamie City Land Conservation Department, but this is the Apple Creek watershed, and Kevin Furmanich gave me these slides. And this is looking at the amount of land cover, because when ag land delivers nutrients and when it doesn't have anything on it, when it's bare. And so one of the keys is to keep land covered in this. So this is a map now that they're developing for the watershed. And this gives you an idea of acres and the amount of cover that has, as a function of year, the different bars of different years. And this is color. So that's in 2014. That's what the profile looked like. 2018. So we are shifting this landscape to higher cover, and that's good. And we still have a long ways to go, but we're going in the right direction. So there's cause for some optimism there. What about climate change? Just in the lower panel there. So in the upper panel, you can say, well, if we do things like conservation tillage or forage cover crops or increased grazing, the base management is the light blue. The other ones all reduce phosphorus and sediment loading. That's great. But you use those same practices and you put climate change on top of that, and you lose most of the gains you have. And so one of the things we're trying to understand is what practices we put in today, will they be resilient under a changed climate? Will they be good enough to get what we need in a changed climate? Because those changes are coming right around the bend. So the idea is to provide a more resilient landscape. I teach a class in restoration ecology, and a couple of times we've been out we're out on the Niske, our research vessel in Green Bay, measuring dissolved oxygen, dead zones, and all of them. Then we also go up into the watershed and meet with an agronomist and look at some of the practices that farmers are employing. He showed us one soybean field in which underneath the soybeans was a heavy carpet of grass. And it was, I planted in annual ryegrass, I believe, and they just planted the beans right in the grass. And he said the grass was almost high enough that the farmer couldn't see over the tractor. And he's kind of shaking his head. I don't know about this, but they knock it down, they crimp it, and then they plant the beans in there, and it did extremely well. So they're doing. Yeah, I mean, and this is all new in a lot of ways, and so, but it's starting to gain some traction, and not just for small guys too. The big guys are doing it too. So, one of the things we're going to do this, and it isn't like you're going to turn a switch. You can spend a lot of money, and it's not a lot of money in my view, but you can spend time and money to put these practices in, and the system will improve, but Mother Nature is highly variable. And so it's not going to be a straight line improvement. It's going to be this oscillation. And so we got to figure out what it is that we want to actually, how good is good enough? If we hit a target 7 out of 10 years, is that good enough? 8 out of 10 years? Ain't gonna be 10 out of 10. And so that's sort of a societal decision. What's our target with respect to improvement in this system? Because you're never going to turn back the clock. It's not going to be like when Native Americans were here. One of the good news items, of course, is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's currently at $300 million. I think it's slated to be $375 million this year. The Biden administration has said they will increase that by $75 million a year, or $25 million a year, until it hits $475 million. That's great. It's not enough, in my view. I'll give an example. The Everglades. The federal government spent $15 billion restoring the Everglades. And the Everglades are great. I like the Everglades, although being under, they're going to be ocean water, and by the end of the century, maybe, who knows. But I guarantee you, they are not as important to this country as the Great Lakes are. And so we're not spending enough. My suggestion is that we set a deadline for restoration. We'll say, okay, by the year 2040, 2050, I don't know what that date is. We can debate what that date is. We say we're going to restore the Great Lakes by this time. And that, to me, that does two things. One, it says, okay, it's our responsibility, right? It is. It's our generation's responsibility to get this done. And it also says, okay, how much are we going to have to spend in order to do that? Let's not keep putting this off, onto the future generation. It's a debt that has been incurred. We should pay it off so that the future doesn't have to pay it. And we can do it. I mean, the Great Lakes are the third largest economy in the world. So don't tell me we don't have the financial ability, because we do, to restore the Great Lakes, and we should do it. I understand that Emily Tyner was here a few weeks ago and gave a presentation about the National Ocean Research Reserve Program. She is the director of that. She's the director of strategic initiatives, freshwater initiatives for UW Green Bay. She's a graduate of our program. I'm very proud of that. So I thought I would just mention it, but then I learned that the National Ocean Research Reserve Program is a program by NOAA. There are 29 of these estuaries around the country. Green Bay would be the 30th. If you're interested, there's Emily's email address, and there's also a link. You can just Google Green Bay National Ocean Research Reserve. It'll provide research dollars and effort in Green Bay. This is a very good thing. It's right under the designation process now. Anne is on I'm delighted to say, is on the site evaluation committee. So that's great, Anne Egan. And I've had a lot of collaborators, a lot of institutions. This isn't all my work, obviously. It's been a great bunch to work with. I really tell you, Wisconsin's got a really good scientific community. We should be very proud of that. So getting into a conclusion now, somebody said, that the ultimate challenge of the 21st century is to reconcile the inherent conflict between human activity and environmental sustainability. And that's true here in Door County, right? It's true everywhere. And I think nowhere is it more problematic or more important than it comes to fresh water. It's a major global challenge. It's estimated within 20 years, half of the world will be without adequate, safe drinking water. Half of the world. Those are billions of people. More people die from waterborne diseases than anything else, including COVID. The School of Freshwater Sciences was formed in 2009. Actually, it was a research institute, been around now for 56 years, or is it 57? I lost track. So the university has had a Great Lakes program for a long time, but it was only in 2009 that they actually formed a School of Freshwater Science, the only school freshwater sciences in the country, if you can believe it. At present, and then in 2014, we opened a new facility. So if you're ever down in Milwaukee, just drop me a line. I'd be happy to show you around. We're a graduate school only at the present. I like this line. This is the son of one of my colleagues, Andrew Jansen. He's in the class of UW. If we don't study the mistakes of the future, we are doomed to repeat them again for the first time. So our goal, one of our, our major mission at the school as scientists is to understand how this system works, because you cannot manage a system unless you understand how it works. And to do that, you need to understand the processes, you need the data that can inform those models, and you need the policies so that you can forecast the future and say, if we do this, how will the system respond? And that's really job one for us. Our research portfolio goes a whole variety of things, everything from ecosystems to atmospheric science and climate. We have a very good atmospheric sciences group that just joined the School of Freshwater Sciences this year. They also offer an undergraduate program. We have a Center for Water Policy. Melissa Scanlon is a director. Some of you may know Melissa. She was the founder of Midwest Environmental Advocates, and an outstanding person. And of course, you may recognize this guy. This is Ann's son, Dan, just a fantastic journalist. I mean, this guy, he's just fantastic. He's writing a new book on phosphorus called The Devil's Element. I love that. He gave me a pre-publication copy, and honestly, you'd think a book about phosphorus, it's a page turner. Honestly, it really is good. I mean, he's just a great storyteller, and he gets it all right. I mean, his book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. I don't know how many you've read that. I hope everybody has. If you hadn't, I have one. I have a door prize for you this evening. And he's now working also for the New York Times, and he just published an article last month about the climate crisis and the impact on Chicago. If you haven't read this, this is terrific, another terrific article by Dan. So our goal is to train the next generation. As I said, we were a graduate school only. Only our first class of students was in 2010. We've had about 120 graduates so far. 95% of these students are getting jobs in the field of freshwater. We're delighted with how well that's going. And there's Emily, our graduate. Very proud of the fact that she's now leading this NEARS effort here in Green Bay. And this fall, we've established a new undergraduate program. And so if you have children or grandchildren, looking at you, that are interested in a rewarding career, freshwater is really, I mean, it is one of the biggest challenges we face today. I don't know if you remember the movie, The Big Short, the last page, the guy who figured it all out, and shorted everything and made millions for his investors. This is the end. And this guy, I forget his name now, is, his next project is investing in water. Yeah. So anyway, he's a smart guy. Of course, and it's not just a Green Bay or a Milwaukee effort. We're actually looking across system. I mean, Wisconsin is like the perfect laboratory for water. I mean, we have the largest, river system in North America, the Mississippi on the west shore. We have Lake Michigan on the east. We have Lake Superior on the north. We have a bunch of Bears fans on the south, but that's okay. But they use a lot of water, 2 billion gallons of water a day, the largest water intake in the world. Serves the city of Chicago, comes out of Lake Michigan. We put together what we call the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin, which is a collaboration of all 13 campuses and now all 26 campuses, including the 2-year campuses around the area of water, because no single institution can face these challenges alone. I have this diagram, this hairball diagram of all the things that interact with water. And some of my faculty said, Val, don't show that. We can't do all that. I said, yeah, that's precisely the point. Nobody can do it all. But if you look at this group of institutions, they can tackle these problems. They can make Wisconsin the place to come to understand and study these problems and come up with the solutions for tomorrow. I really believe that. We've persuaded the state legislature, which is no easy task, to give us $5 million in the next biennium to go towards this. Now it's only, it's less than 10% of what we think we need, but at least we're getting there. And then I couldn't finish without talking about a project that I've been involved with for many years now, for our new research vessel. The RV Niske is 67 years old. She's a 71-foot converted Army T-boat. She served in the Korean War. I tell you how far back that goes. We're now in the process of fundraising for a new research vessel. We need to raise $20 million. We're about halfway there. It's a design by Seacraft Design, Surgeon Bay. I don't know if you know Mark Pudlow out of Seacraft in Green Bay. We did get a $10 million naming gift. You don't see me in a tie very often, but for $10 million, I'll wear anything. So, but we still have a ways to go. And so if anyone here is interested, many other naming opportunities, don't leave, give me your name. No donation too small. So final thought. The Great Lakes are closed systems. The water residence time, for example, for Lake Michigan is 100 years. That means for all intents and purposes, anything you dump in, throw in, toss in, leak in, get into the lake, you dump it in today, I said, there's a good chance you will drink it tomorrow because we drink this water. Well, water is 60% of your body, 80% of your blood, 70% of your brain is water. So if you're like me or like you, around here, you are more Lake Michigan than you are anything else. Think about that. You are more Lake Michigan. Your little pockets of Lake Michigan walking around. Or whatever water source you have, be if it's groundwater, you are that groundwater. So the old saying, you are what you eat, but you are more what you drink. So what's it going to be? And these are both unretouched photographs of the Great Lakes. So a final thought, someone has said, if we don't inherit the environment from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And that's absolutely true. I really believe it is our responsibility to restore these systems, to protect these systems going forward. We don't want to put it off on these guys. We don't. And it's not necessary. We have the financial ability to do this. We just got to generate the political will. That's my grandson. He was standing out on Whitefish shores just yesterday and loving it every second. Well, thank you.
So Mark, it's Jess here on the Zoom.
And if you're
Mark,
a Facebook person, which I'm not, there's our Facebook page. Our younger crowd will be delighted if you like us on Facebook. So I go, oh Val, good job. So I'll be happy to take any questions.
Mark, this is Jess on Zoom.
Yes, sir. Yes. So the one that comes closest to, there are two actually. There's the Alliance for the Great Lakes, which is both US and Canadian, because Canada obviously has a huge stake in the Great Lakes. And there's the Healing Our Waters Coalition, which is actually a group of many of the environmental, in fact, I don't know if Door County Environmental Council is a member of the Great Lakes, the How Coalition or not. But anyway, those two groups have a basin-wide perspective. There are lots, obviously. And, like politics, environmental protection is much local, right? So I think organizations like the Door County Environmental Council, extremely important because that's where the rubber meets the road. So, yeah. Oh, okay, sure. So you heard the answer. The question was, are there, if I got it right, is there a sort of an overarching organization or organizations that really deal with all of Great Lakes issues holistically? And I mentioned two, the Alliance for the Great Lakes and the Healing Our Waters Coalition. The Alliance for the Great Lakes, for example, is very active in the Fox Wolf watershed. They have a very strong program. In fact, is led by one of our graduates. So I'm very proud of that. Yes. That's a good question. I don't know. The question is there a representative from the pharmaceutical industry involved? I don't think so. So I'll give you an interesting example. This happened several years ago. Rebecca was doing some studies on Prozac, which, you know, is a pretty commonly prescribed drug. She was showing that effects on fathead minnows, for example, that they have a very elaborate breeding behavior. The female will lay her eggs under a rock. The male will fertilize those eggs and he'll guard that nest until they hatch out. Well, very low concentrations of Prozac, you know, concentration we would see in the environment, the male would sort of like, the female would, yeah, she wouldn't care. She'd broadcast her eggs in the bottom of the tank, and male would just, I don't care. You know, if you read the side effects for humans, same side effect. But in any case, the net result was reproduction would fail. When she tried to publish these results, and then some of her results on the yellow perch and the impact of metformin, she got a lot of pushback from the pharmaceutical industry, criticizing her study, saying not enough replicates. No, she's dead on. She's got it right. So, yeah. Yes, and International Joint Commission. What's the function of the International Joint Commission? So the IJC is a joint treaty between the US and Canada. It dates back to, I think, 1909, so it's been around for over 100 years. Its major function is to deal with the boundary waters between the US and Canada, which extend all the way from the Atlantic Ocean almost all the way to the Pacific, right? But of course, the biggest part of that is the Great Lakes. One of the things that they have a number of boards. They have a science advisory board. I'm on that board. And they also have a water control board, which looks at lake levels and what controls is possible in the Great Lakes. They produce what they call a triennial assessment of progress. There is an agreement, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is a joint agreement between the US and Canada, and they oversee that agreement. They are advisory only. They don't really have any regulatory authority whatsoever, but they do have a bully pulpit. And one of the things they are funding now is development of a decadal scale Great Lakes research plan, which has never been done in the Great Lakes. Oceanography has done many times. And so I'm very optimistic that we'll put together a decadal scale plan, because if you're going to restore the Great Lakes, you got to know what you're doing, right? Right. In order to do that, as I said, in order to do that, you have to understand how the system functions. So you really have to have the science in place. So when you spend restoration dollars, you know that you're going to get the bang for the buck and that they'll be lasting. It'll be as permanent as possible. You can't do that unless you understand how the system functions. So the IJC plays a very important role. There are 3 commissioners in Canada and 3 commissioners from the US. They are appointed by their political appointments. So each administration they turn over. We have a very good commission at the moment, I think. Let's see. Old summer cottages in the woods are being replaced by new big homes on clear-cut lots with lawns. To what extent does the fertilizer on these lawns contribute to algal blooms? Well, it's a good question. I don't know. It depends on where they are in the watershed and what sort of interception can occur. In Milwaukee, you cannot, I think in Wisconsin in general now, you cannot buy fertilizer with phosphorus in it. You don't need to. I mean, we fertilize our grass and we use Milorganite, which is of course a little bit of us. It's the product of the sewage treatment plant. So, but as I said before, I mean, everybody contributes. We all own a little piece of something. And so how we treat that land, it eventually, water always runs downhill. And even if it doesn't run off, it seeps into the ground. And so think about, what we're doing. So yeah, everybody's got a stake in this. Okay. Yeah, okay, some more in the back. Yes. Yeah. I should have you answering some of these questions about it. So the question was from an operator here, and your farm is in this watershed, I take it. Yeah. You know, what role have our universities and research sciences playing in trying to look at sustainable agricultural practices? And I think they're gaining ground. I mean, University of Madison's got a big agriculture program. Milwaukee doesn't, you know. Green Bay has a few people that are looking at the impact of different land use practices. And I think that's getting out. And you can see some of the studies have been done in Apple Creek and elsewhere. And so it's, you know, but largely I think I mean, you could probably speak to this better. I mean, the average farmer is not going to listen to me, but I think they will listen to an agronomist or, someone, and we need more of those guys out there. I think, someone said, the average agronomist can cover maybe, I don't know, 20,000 acres, and that's all. And so if you look at our watershed, we probably need 10 or 20 agronomists, and we don't have that many. We really need to invest in helping farmers, in dealing with some of this, and we got to help, subsidize it as well. But I think my feeling is that we can't deal with just carrots. I mean, at some point, because there's always going to be some guy who's not going to be like you and who's not going to, at some point we need regulation. And the reason I think that is then it's a fair playing field. Everybody's got to do it. Nobody has an advantage. Does it mean we're going to have to pay more for food? Yeah, I think so. We should. It's cheap, right? And I'm sympathetic to farmers because they basically buy in the retail market, sell in the wholesale. They're caught on both ends. They don't control either market, what they buy or sell to. And so it's a really tough business. You're at the whims of Mother Nature, but we can't live without it, right? And so we got to figure it out. I think we can, and we need to help farmers do the right thing. So I appreciate the fact that you are doing the right thing. That's fantastic. And it's actually guys like you that I think will be the key to the future, because they'll listen to you. They'll listen to you, I think. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in the back. Yeah. So the question in short was, how do we deal with manure management and in this system and going forward? One, I think you got to look at the carrying capacity of the land, right? I mean, you can only put so many cows on land. Years ago, I was told that, suburban expansion around Green Bay was sort of contracted by the fact that farmers needed that land in order to spread manure. And in the springtime now, you can see the trucks rolling, and they're taking it out of Brown County. I mean, they're exporting manure to other places to get rid of it. It is a valuable commodity to the farmer because it does contain nutrients, but in some cases we're overwhelming the land. Now there are techniques, and they're looking into basically putting what is effectively a sewage treatment plant on some of these big industrial farms, and with digesters which produce methane, which can generate power. The byproduct we use is bedding, etc. So I mean, we can solve these problems. Part of what we're dealing with in the Green Bay watershed, though, is a legacy of high phosphorus concentrations in the soil. There's a lot more phosphorus in the soil than is needed. The farmer can put phosphorus on and take the crop off, and I can be at balance. But if the soil is already elevated, we're not going to gain any ground, and that's true in a lot of this watershed. So, but we're making progress. Yes. Yeah, so the question relates to the goal of making Bay Beach a, fishable, swimmable, recreational beach again. And there, it can be done. I'll tell you this though, that if we can get Bay Beach swimmable, then the rest of the bay is going to look really good. It's in a tough position because it's inside, the Sawbo and Longtail Point. It's in a very restricted. The sewage treatment plant does discharge, but I honestly suspect that what it discharges into that area is relatively small relative to the non-point source. So it's coming down the Fox River. It's going to be tough, I think, to make that a swimmable area. But we should, again, it's something we can do. I mean, water quality in Green Bay has improved dramatically. I mean, years ago, the dissolved oxygen in the wintertime under the ice was 0. Now we've been out there in the wintertime and it's, super saturated. So the waste load allocation program that was put in place, I mean, the Fox River was one of the most heavily industrialized rivers in the world because of all the paper mills. And basically now their net discharge is 0. And what they do discharge, they discharge to the sewage treatment plant. So, that there's been a remarkable improvement in water quality in the Fox River to the point where they now are concerned about lamprey eel getting up, because previously the water was too polluted and lampreys wouldn't get. Now they're starting to see lamprey eels caught at the De Pere Dam. So yeah, I don't know if it answers the question, but yeah. Anything else? I don't want to keep any longer than necessary. I really appreciate your coming out this evening. Yes. So, yes. So the question was a result of the Great Lakes Water Compact, which was passed in 2008. Took act of the U.S. Congress. It's an agreement among all 8 Great Lakes states. It prohibits diversions of Great Lakes water outside the basin with 2 exceptions. Those exceptions are for what's known as a straddling community and a straddling county. The straddling community is a community that lies both inside and outside the Great Lakes Basin. An example of that in Milwaukee would be the suburb of New Berlin, which covers the Continental Divide. And you realize that the Continental Divide, shrinks to very little, and down in Chicago, it's like very small. In Milwaukee, you go 16 miles west and you are now in the Mississippi drainage. The other exception is what's known as a straddling county. Now, in the straddling community instance, the New Berlin instance, all that requires is the approval of the State Department of Natural Resources. And so they've approved that diversion to the town of New Berlin. They were already connected to the Milwaukee sewage treatment plant, so they send their water back. The condition is that 100% of your withdrawal has to go back to the basin. So you may divert it out, but you got to put it all back. So the other, one that's been, controversial is Waukesha, which is totally outside the basin, but it's in a straddling county. And they have applied for and been approved for a Great Lakes water quality diversion. The other, and they have to return the water. And so they're looking at returning the water actually to the Root River, rather than build a pipeline all the way back, which would be very expensive. They're going to put it in Root River, and that's sort of controversial too, because at base flow conditions, a large fraction of maybe more than half of the flow in the river will actually be sewage effluent. But that remains to be seen. Those are the 2. The other exception is in bottled water. There's an exclusion there for bottled water to be taken out in containers no larger than 5 gallons. So my feeling is the volume of water is negligible. There was a proposal, and this sort of triggered the Great Lakes Compact. The Canadian government approved, the province approved a diversion of a tanker to take Lake Superior water out of Lake Superior, fill it with water, and take it to China. It's, you know, this water is, I mean, if you're going to put it in a tanker and take it to China, I mean, it must be pretty valuable. So, but that caused a huge uproar, and they quickly, you know, reneged the permit. I think it was it Tommy Thompson once famously said, you know, you can take as much water out of the Great Lakes as you want. Take it anyway, as long as you add hops to it and put it in a can. So anyway, so thank you very much. I appreciate it. Oh, one last thing. One last thing. Anybody have a birthday this week? Well, I mean, this week, within the last week or the coming week. You do? All right. Have you ever read Dan's book? Okay, there you go. And that is, I mean, that's an award-winning New York Times best-selling book. And another one who's also a policy fellow at the school is Seth Siegel, who's also a New York Times best-selling author. He wrote Let There Be Water, and this is his most recent book, Troubled Water, What's Wrong with What We Drink. Talks a lot about PFAS and other things in there. So let's see. Who has been a member of the Door County Environmental Consortium for the longest? Who goes back 10 years? 20? Oh, nobody more than 10? Oh, there you go.